Good evening, buonasera, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò della New York University. And we are here tonight to present the new book by Paul Moses, The Italian Squad. Yes. And as you may know, it's a book that talks about the Italian Squad that was a division of the NYPD created to fight Italian organized crime. And of course, the hero of the whole story is Giuseppe Petrosino, a detective that was then killed during one of his trips to Sicily, where he was investigating. And I remember as a young kid, there was this TV series in Italy, and all of a sudden, the name that we had never heard before, Giuseppe Petrosino, became a household name. And we started playing, cops and bandits, and everybody wanted to be Giuseppe Petrosino in Italy. And I'm very, very happy that Paul wrote this book and decided to accept our invitation to present here at the Casa. His previous book, An Unlikely Union, it's about the relationship between the Italian and the Irish in New York, was presented here and was also a great success. And I always say it's one of the books presented here that I quote most often, because my students and many of our guests have questions about this, and that's where I direct them. Go straight to Paul Moses, An Unlikely Union. He's a former professor of journalism at CUNY, and from the title of this book and the previous that I mentioned, you sort of have an idea of his area of interest, but he also wrote about Francis of Assisi, so also more in an historical perspective. And with Paul, we have the pleasure of having here tonight Maria Laurino, who is also a guest before. She's a good friend of the Casa, and she just published her latest book in Italian, in Italy, Il prezzo degli innocenti, The Price of Innocence, how the Vatican subtracted thousands of kids to their mothers. And this book was just published in Italy. Maria was there for a tour to present it. She's going to come back to present it here at the Casa, of course, if she doesn't get in trouble before. And she's waiting for a publication date for the English version of this film. It's a great evening. I'm looking forward to sit down with you and just listen to the conversation with them and then opening up to the Q&A. Please welcome Maria Laurino and Paul Moses.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Stefano. It's so wonderful to be here. I always feel at home at the Casa. And it's great to be here to celebrate Paul's book, which is just wonderful.
Thank you, Maria.
It's such a rich story. Your archival research is incredible. I want to ask you about that during the course of this evening. And this really rich detail where you take us back to the early 20th century, where it was a really hard place to be an immigrant. It's always hard, but it was a particularly brutal time. So as Stefano says, you begin your book by writing about the man who's at the center of trying to make New York a better, safer place, Giuseppe Petrosino. Now, I know he was a star in Italy. I didn't realize this. And the book is about the police officers who came after him, the members of the Italian squad. But for those of us in the room who don't know about Petrosino, could you start there to tell us a little bit about who he was? You start off on his last mission to Sicily. What he contributed and why organized crime wanted to eliminate him.
Sure. He was an immigrant from Campania. He came to New York when he was still a boy and managed to get in with the police department by impressing a police inspector who was supervising garbage scows in those days, because some street cleaning fell under the police department. After a period of years in which he was kind of like ignored, like, as a young cop. Eventually, he caught the eye of Teddy Roosevelt, who was police commissioner for a spell, and he was promoted to detective. And that's when his career really began to take off. He was really the only one around who could solve these crimes in the Italian community that was so mystifying to the police. So he became a household name pretty early on. Famous for his disguises, for infiltrating and just going to listen. And eventually, he's appointed to head this squad in 1904 called the Italian Squad. Already kind of a star at that point in kind of the New York media world. And then 5 years later, he is off on a not secret enough mission to Sicily, in which he's murdered in Palermo. And certainly that kind of seals his story as I don't know, I think probably the most famous individual officer in the NYPD's history, and considered one of the greatest heroes. And so he's well remembered. His story's been written about a lot, even in his lifetime. There was a movie made called The Detectives of the Italian Bureau, one of the very early movies. Comic books, serial novels, all kinds of stuff. So he was even famous before he was murdered, and after his murder, it just, so people remember him still. He lived not too far from here on Lafayette Street.
And about like 200,000 people came to his funeral, right? Do you think he's the most celebrated police officer in the history of the department?
I would think so, yeah. I would say. And I still remember today, there's an association in his name, and they have a dinner, and they have a ceremony every year at his gravesite at Calvary Cemetery. So yes, he's a big deal, and I think for that reason, and he's been written about so much, for that reason I focused more on the officers who followed him. But I think he's still a major character in the book. When I look at the index, I think he's mentioned more than anybody else. So he kind of appears in flashback, really, because he so shaped this squad, and it's like he's the person in the room, even though he's gone. So yeah, he figures in the story throughout, and of course they always hope to solve his murder.
Right. Yeah, he really is the guiding force of the book, and such a central focus. And even some of the cases you talk about go back to, that they're still trying to solve, go back to his murder. You wrote that you saw his death as the beginning of the story, not the ending.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Well, I was intrigued that these other officers, continued on after what happened to him. It was very dangerous work. And so that seemed like the starting point of an interesting story that has not been told very much. So, I didn't want to repeat everything that's been written before. So I kind of moved forward from there. And it's kind of a dramatic device. It kind of works. I always love those stories where you have the person who never shows up on the stage but is like kind of the main character. I sort of had that in mind too.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the context of this time, the late 19th century, early 20th century, and this group that they were fighting, the Black Hand? A lot of people tend to think when they hear about the Black Hand and the kind of crimes that were going on that this was a kind of early mafia. But you argue that actually it's not. It was a completely separate entity. I think maybe
Yeah,
you say
no,
differently, but how could you talk about that and what they did, what they did to these neighborhoods?
So in 1903, there was a contractor in Brooklyn named Capiello, and he got an extortion letter, as often happens in immigrant communities, and was told to pay up such and such an amount of money somewhere in Bensonhurst, Bay Parkway, or 72nd Street, or something like that. And the extortionists came up with this idea of putting a black hand on the letter. And the case was solved pretty much right away, but that black hand just soared in the imagination of the reporters at papers like the World, say, New York World. And it was depicted as this sinister international organization controlled from either the Sicily or Naples, depending on what you were reading. And it was never that, but it was an open invitation to bad people to use the same logo in order to extort money from people who were moderately successful in their community. And that's what happened. It was really disconnected groups of thugs who were using this, but it was never a single broad conspiracy like you would argue that maybe the Mafia is, or a Mafia family.
Well, it was so terrifying, this idea that you could be targeted by the Black Hand, that I guess it took on this much larger idea in the imagination.
Yeah, and there were serious crimes. There were bombings. There were terrible kidnappings. So it's not as if there was no crime and it was all invented. But I think the crime kind of festered because the police department really had no handle on the Italian community, and the Italian community based on experiences in Italy, didn't have much interest in working with the police either. So these officers like Petrosino and the others who followed him, Anthony Vachris, Charles Corrao, Michael Fiaschetti, and others, they were really like a bridge, that where hopefully Italians who were being victimized would feel comfortable in talking to the police, and they could in turn do the work that you want police to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, this use of terrorist tactics, the bombings, the targeting of civilians, the kidnappings, it's so terrifying to think back at that time. And could you talk about that, like what would provoke the kidnapping of a child? And if there's a particular case that stands out to you, and how the Italian squad became involved?
If somebody was just moderately successful, maybe they owned a little grocery store or something like that. One of the cases that really caught my eye was about a man whose son had been injured in some kind of automobile accident, and the word in the neighborhood was that they were going to get a big windfall in a lawsuit because they had gotten help at one of the hospitals. Some of the workers there put them in touch with a lawyer, and one day this fellow bought an old jalopy, and that was a big thing to have a car. And unfortunately, his wife told some neighbor, "Yeah, he bought an old car, but we could afford a brand new one if we wanted." Well, that was a big mistake because that led to a kidnapping plot aimed at their child. So even just the illusion that somebody had a bit of money could set them up. But again, this is not a big organized thing. This is somebody who lived across the street, who kind of got it started and maybe connected up with other people who were more experienced in crime. Mm-hmm. So it's a tough environment. I think of my own ancestors living there on Mott Street, and my aunts and uncles growing up there, and just this was going on all around them. Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about your ancestors.
Well, my mother's father was from the Aspromonte Mountains in Calabria, a little village called Chirazi. And my friends, they always like it when I mention their village. And my mother's mother was from a little larger village in Basilicata called Lorenzana. And so they lived there on different addresses on Mott Street. I guess the odd number side, because I think there's people from different regions lived on different sides of the street, right? And around 1929, after the death of my mother's mother, my grandmother, they moved to Brooklyn out towards Bay Ridge. So, for quite a long time, they were really in the middle of this world. So many of the things I write about, the gangs and everything, they were just there. Yeah.
Well, you write, right? I think you write that there were 130 bombings during the first 9 months of 1913.
Yeah.
It's so hard to.
Yeah. No, there was one gang in particular that was doing this on a contract basis. So after a while, you do start seeing organized crime emerging from these little cells, And so this gang was just making and doing the bombing. So if you didn't like somebody, you could go to them, and they were bombing tenements at night. I mean, crowded tenements. It was really dangerous.
And also, the explosives were so crude, so they could target a building and take out the whole block, right?
Yeah. No, there's no precision bombing. Yeah.
And also the fame. It was mostly the poor and the vulnerable. But Enrico Caruso, the opera singer, right? Wasn't that a?
Yes, there's a chapter. Enrico Caruso was the target of an extortion attempt by a pretty sophisticated gang. Those people were on the way to being mafiosi. And this was after Giuseppe Petrosino died. And it's often been presented as a big success for Petrosino, but he was gone already. But actually, the case was kind of a disaster, as I recount. But Caruso survived and was even he was really afraid to, but he went and testified which was a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't he supposed to bring the money somewhere? And he was like, no, somebody else can do that.
He
for
sent
me.
his valet or something
Yes,
to
it's good to
drop
have a
the
valet
money
to send the money for you.
in some stairwell, like in what we would now call Red Hook, I guess. So yeah, no, he wasn't going there at night with that. Yeah. The problem with the case was that, first of all, the problem with the case was that they moved in too quick. The suspects didn't touch the bait, and they should have waited, and so they were never able to really make the case stick. But
When we talk about these communities and your family being in the middle of this, what often happens with immigrant communities of yesterday and of today is that the crimes of the few cast suspicion on the whole. And the other thing that I think you do such a good job of in this book is talk about this sort of larger context of this prejudice on many levels, and also the beginnings of the eugenics movement in this country.
I think the whole eugenics idea, that is that, some races are superior, some are inferior, based on kind of phony criteria like the shapes of people's skulls and all that. I think that's a big factor to think about when you're thinking back on what happened then, because that's something that's certainly unacceptable now. But at that time, it was really acceptable academic opinion. And the people who were the main proponents were like, one fellow founded the American Sociological Association, and he helped found the American Association of University Professors. These are like, they were the mainstream. And so those views, you see it reflected in the words of journalists, judges, all kinds of people. And it just affects the overall view of society that, well, these Italians are from southern Italy in particular, they'll never be Americans, they're not fit to be. That's when they passed the law in 1924 that stopped the migration, the sponsor said it flat out. We want to keep the same kind of people who were here before.
Right.
So I think you have to think about that, because we talk about prejudice, but here it was really reinforced in many ways. So there was a lot for those immigrants to overcome, and yeah.
Well, you're mentioning one of my favorite professors to hate at the time, Edward Ellsworth Ross.
Edward Ross, yes.
Who you
yes.
talk about the size of the head. I have a sentence for you here that, yes, when he wrote about Italian Americans, according to Ross, we had a distressing frequency of low foreheads, open mouths, knobby crania, and backless heads. There was actually a longer description, but I cut out more of those adjectives. And then he wrote, such people lack the power to take rational care of themselves. He taught at Stanford and at Cornell and was a department chair at the University of Wisconsin. Well, what is a backless head? What was the shape of the heads picking university professors in those days?
I don't know. The Italians aren't the only group this was done to, but it hit them very hard. If you look at cartoons from the period when the Irish were heavily discriminated against, they're often portrayed. There you'll see the backless head, whatever that is, the high brow and all that. That's or low brow, I guess. And so it's just a fact that we wouldn't think much about it today, but it really weighed on the discourse in those days.
Well, the Nazis used our ideas of the eugenics movement.
Certainly, yes. And yes, Stefano is right. Yes.
And the interesting thing is the Italians were the victims of this characterization based on pseudoscientific observation of the anatomy of the person. And it all started in Italy. Interesting thing is that it was a physician that became the founder of criminal anthropology. His name was Cesare Lombroso from Turin. He was Jewish and a socialist. So you would not suspect him of being a racist who starts this whole discourse. And his museum, the Museum of Criminal Anthropology in Torino, has just been restored. And they also had to reconceive it, because you could not possibly present the kind of things that he shows with the same captions that he used. And it's a very, very interesting place, because exactly where these, and he was fascinated by two figures, the criminal and the genius, because for him, they were equally going astray from what should be the mainstream. So he would look at the same way, with the same criteria, for example, of measuring the distance between the beginning of the nose and the hairline, to geniuses and to criminals. And then he conducted extensive research in asylums or criminal asylums. And then he recanted some of his theories because he saw the beginning of the anti-Semitic racial laws. But he was somehow the father of these tendencies that granted everything that science could grant in terms of protecting these discourse that to us today seems absolutely crazy. But then you saw that already there was some element of odd connection, and you understand, for example, that he had a phase in his scientific life in which he was basically guided by, how do you call it, sedute spiritiche, Ouija board or...
Really?
Yeah, and there are very accurate chronicles of these sessions in which they would hear voices from spirits. It's a very, very complicated and awkward and odd thing. Then when they dig out the bones of Dante, for example, to go back to physiology, anthropology, the whole discussion was what can you infer and understand about Dante the poet by looking at his bones. So it's a very detailed anatomopathological discussion of the bones, the cranium, the pelvis, but trying to get conclusions. What does it tell us about the whole thing? Right. And in that case, too, they also went through, how do you call it, the sessions? The seances, in which they asked the spirit, whether is this really the skeleton of Dante? So it's this mixture of pseudoscience, but practiced by people that were considered real scientists, that sort of brought to allowing a discourse that has nothing scientific at all. And unfortunately, it came from Italy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's one of the ironies of it, yeah. That's true. Mm-hmm.
So, and that was a central struggle of Petrosino, right? Trying to talk about that he was arguing, right, that the crime problem came from these criminals escaping Italy to try to find safe harbor here.
Right, that's right. Italy's justice system was quite harsh, so there were people who did commit crimes there and who would flee to New York, and Petrosino believed very strongly that if he could just get those people and send them back to Italy, the problem would really be just an ordinary to solve crime problem. And that's why he was actually in Sicily when he was murdered. He was collecting the certificates, that would prove this from the system there. And so he died trying to get them. Then Lieutenant Anthony Vachris. Was there any relatives of the Vachris family here? No, oh, too bad. Okay. Lieutenant Vachris went over and completed the mission. Again, taking a great risk, comes back, and the politics changed, and the certificates were put in a drawer, and Vachris was put on desk duty for a while. So these documents that Petrosino literally died trying to get were never really adequately used.
Yeah, that was incredible frustration reading that in your book on how no one, and the internal politics that kept going on.
Vachris was very frustrated. I know that, yeah.
So, well, there's so many levels of this kind of prejudice and frustration. There's also the frustration of the Italian squad that the community was afraid to come forward.
Yeah.
Right. And their fears were certainly legitimate because you're dealing with people who are kidnapping your child. But there's also, I think, this tendency among Italians of keep everything to yourself, distrust, don't distrust the stranger.
Yeah, the whole idea of omerta. I don't know, one prominent law enforcement official from the time wrote that you pick up any Bowery swell and they'll do the same thing. It's just like there's a code. So I know it's been really kind of portrayed as an Italian thing, but anyway, there was a problem in communication, and it was very frustrating. I know I found Petrosino left behind some records with his family, and I saw in those that he had written out a draft proposal of what he wanted to do. He was discussing if you got a blackmail threat and didn't report it, you were responsible for the damage of the bomb. or and and if so he actually wanted to prosecute, or at least talked about it, the people who weren't cooperating. So and it never got anywhere. But I found it's something he was writing to himself anyway. So yeah, they were very frustrated by that. On the other hand, it was pretty difficult to protect people in those days. They didn't have the mechanisms that we have now. So there's reasons that people were reluctant to testify. What did happen a lot was that the detectives would kind of know what was going on, but they were in a position of not being able to prove it, right? Because people wouldn't testify, which is why the idea of deporting the people they believed to be the criminals based on their previous record in Italy was a good idea. They didn't need much evidence beyond the proof that they had been convicted. So.
And then one more level of frustration was also the prejudice within the department. One more level of prejudice, and frustration within the department, right? That the Italian squad were not recognized, or they were being passed over for promotions, that there wasn't this sense of what they were doing was...
They were clearly marginalized. It's hard to point out one particular case and say this is an act of discrimination, but it was a pattern. So many of them had problems getting hired, getting promoted, that you see it was hard. I write in the book, a later chapter is about one young detective who went undercover in an anarchist ring. And because of his work, there was a very big, highly publicized case, which he took a lot of heat for personally. He was kind of cast as the bad guy. And he really was deserving of a promotion. And he didn't get it. There were like 80 first grade detectives in the headquarters division, and there were like 2 of them had Italian names. So it was hard for them to get promoted.
And sometimes you write that the detectives would actually turn to the press to try to get attention. I think Fiaschetti was kind of a master of that.
That was their wild card because they were very popular with the reporters, and so they could go. They weren't going to the press for themselves, like being treated unfairly, but they were going and publicizing their cases and talking about what they needed, and they did often use that clout to often speak in defense of Italians, by the way. All of them did that. And also to say, no, the Black Hand is not this single conspiracy. And it would be reported, but it just never got traction.
And then there was also the backlash within the Italian-American community that this is years later as the Italian squad continued, that they didn't like being singled out as the bad guys.
At a certain point, I'm surprised it didn't occur from the beginning. At a certain point, some of the leaders of the community say, hey, why is there an Italian squad? There's not a Polish squad or whatever, right? And the publisher of Il Progresso was on that, and one of the detectives on the unit, Charles Corrao, he had a brother who was kind of the Italian political organizer in Brooklyn, Frank Corrao. They were on this and began to demand that that be changed. Not just the name; they didn't like the unit. And then there was another group in the Italian community who wanted it and said the others are doing this only because you're in with the bad guys. And it was very nasty battle fought out in their local newspapers. And but when it was created, the same people who wanted to stop it were calling for it. But I think at a certain point they just said, we're being portrayed as a problem here, and this is not right.
Do you think that was a fair criticism, or do you think that actually ended up hurting the community, what the squad could have done, because it was eventually disbanded?
I think they needed a specialized unit for a while, or they could have changed the name or something, called it a racket squad or something like that. So periodically it would fall in and out of political favor. It was canceled for a while, but I found, like often happens in a bureaucracy, it sort of existed in a shadow state, right? the same veteran detectives were doing similar work, but and often the papers just called them the Italian Squad, even though they had been canceled. And then it came back again around like 1918 or so, and lasted until 1922, and then it was folded into the Bomb Squad. The Bomb Squad really didn't do that kind of work. It was really more of like a radical squad, the Bomb Squad. And so I argue in the book that just when they really needed it most in Prohibition, they didn't have it. And there was literally like a curbside stock market for liquor, within in the Italian community, within a block or two of police headquarters. So it was pretty open.
Yeah, and then so the chance of trying to stem what would grow into this massive organized crime was lost. That opportunity.
Right. They may not in the 1920s. They may not have been in the will to do that. So yeah.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions, and I want to open it up to the audience. I want just if you could talk a little bit about your research, because there's so much research that was done here. Use of the archives, memoirs, personal diaries. How did you just tell us how you kind of got this inspiration and where you went? And
well, it came out of the previous book I did that Stefano mentioned on the Irish and Italians in New York. So I do have a chapter in there that talks about Giuseppe Petrosino trying to work his way up in the police department, and then how his death kind of really, for at least a day, brought all the Irish and the Italians, everybody together in mourning this man. And I just felt there was a lot more to the story than I could tell in that book. And I especially noticed then that the story after Petrosino wasn't written about much, and that it seemed very interesting to me. So that's how I came to it. I probably started out, I started out by going through, just an enormous number of newspaper articles about the Italian Squad from that period. But I think that tends to also be a problem with history of organized crime, because the newspapers they're not always that accurate. I mean, some of the reporting's brilliant, but you really kind of have to watch what's in there. And if you read the papers, you would just assume that there was a black can being run by some guy in Palermo, and that wasn't the case. So that involved then kind of backing all that up against court records were pretty good. I used a lot of things in Ancestry.com, census and passport records and shipping, manifests and all that stuff. Sing Sing prison records were the admission records were in there also. So that was a big help. The Secret Service, there's no police records around from that period, but the Secret Service had some good stuff, because they had their agents did daily reports, and those still are around, very detailed reports, and they worked in cooperation with the Italian Squad, and the bad guys of the book, the big bad guys, was called the Lupo Morello gang, probably the people behind Joseph Petrosino's murder. The Secret Service was the one who got them convicted of counterfeiting, and the leaders got very long prison terms, 25 and 30 years, which of course they got out long before that. And so those records were very useful in getting a lot of details. And then there were some archives. The poor U.S. consul in Palermo, who was there when Petrosino was murdered, and who himself got death threats. He was a novelist who had been teaching Romance languages at Yale before he got this job, and all of a sudden he's in the middle of this really threatening world. He'd already gotten through the earthquake in 1908. So then if people thought he was gone, there were stories in the paper saying that he was believed dead. So he left an archive at Yale that offered a lot of details about Joseph Petrosino and that part of the book. And the Vachris family had some records that they shared with me. In particular, Anthony Vachris went to Italy and with another detective, completed Petrosino's mission shortly after he was killed, went right back. Well, he kept a diary of that trip. And they shared that with me. That's one of my favorite things because you really know what's going on then, and you get much more of a sense for the person and his family. And when you check that, it's probably a good journalism article. But when you check that against what was in the papers, it's way off. It was scary to me. And as a reporter who covered, police, and, well, not so much police, but courts and City Hall, it's not that different back then than now. Maybe not. I should say it's not that different from back then to when I did it in the 80s and 90s, and that really shows how careful you have to be with some of the things that get into the historical record.
Well, and also some of the recollections of the Italian squad members themselves, right? Like Fiaschetti wrote, he basically liked to embellish, didn't he? And didn't he write his own
Michael
book about?
Fiaschetti was the last commander of the squad, and he was a really great detective, nationally known, but he totally embellished everything he did. He didn't need to. I don't know why he
Can you
did
tell
it.
about the ghost story? I thought that was very funny. What are they called? The Good Killers and the Ghost
The
Stories?
Good Killers gang, yeah. This is like a Murder, Inc. kind of gang. Yeah, there was a murder. A man came in and claimed he was being followed, wanted to tell the police everything, and they were after him, yes, because he had been pushed by the gang. It was kind of the Bonaventri. It's kind of the early beginnings of the Bonanno crime family gang. He had been pushed by the gang to murder this man who was a friend of his back from Castellamare in Sicily. And then he became convinced, probably logically, that they were going to murder him next, right? So he came in, and he wasn't giving everything, so Fiaschetti assigned another detective named James Pellegrino to just kind of spend the night with him. And then Fiaschetti says that he was actually the one who spent the night. The story changes. But supposedly in his sleep, the man saw the ghost of the person he killed. And he's totally terrified of the ghost. And he tries to even jump out the window. And Fiaschetti or Pellegrino, whichever version, tried to keep him from doing it. And this is how Fiaschetti found out what really happened in this murder. So this ghost story did not impress the prosecutors at all. But it really was a great story in the papers, yes.
Do you think there was any truth? Do you think he just made the whole thing up?
I think that they made that
whole
up.
thing up,
Judging from other things I saw that they made up. Fiaschetti did a memoir. He hooked up with a very good writer named Prospero Baronelli, who also the father of the newspaper crossword puzzle. A very talented guy who wrote novels and books and really had the hard-boiled detective fiction style down pat. And so he basically shaped Fiaschetti to fit that detective fiction, because this is the 20s, is the era of all these detective magazines, the golden age of detective fiction, they call it. So it's unfortunate, because as a writer, I like the story to be spectacular, as he says, but it wasn't.
Right.
You know?
There's always that truth matter.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And just one final question. Lessons for today. What we can take from your book about the treatment and the judgment of New Orleans communities, about anger and jealousy and how they manifest, about policing tactics. I don't know. What to you do you see as the lessons?
The thing that I focus on is the importance of police-community relations. There's a lot of other things that they would sort of the father to a lot of law enforcement tactics that came up later with organized crime, the need for RICO and all that stuff. But to me, the thing that seemed most relevant to me right now was this ongoing issue between police and minority communities, and that the Italian squad detectives were just at the cutting edge of that in their own time. And how they did it, I think is got a lot of useful lessons for us now. Mm-hmm.
Which we could certainly use. Questions, audience? Yeah, back there.
Wait for the microphone.
Was his body brought back to the States? Yes, it was, John. Joseph Petrosino's body was brought back, and I saw all the manifests and the letters back and forth and all that in the consul's papers, actually. But yes, it took a little while. I think his funeral, he was murdered like on March 12th. I think the funeral was, I don't know, I'm going to guess April 12th, about a month later. Yeah.
You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. What was his relationship and feelings towards the Italian squad?
I would think he would be supportive of it. He remained in touch with Petrosino. There's correspondence occasionally between him and Petrosino. At a certain point after the King of Italy was murdered, he was sent to undercover. Petrosino was sent at the request. The Italian government wanted an investigation of the community in Paterson, where this kind of was connected to. And Petrosino, at the request of President McKinley, but because of Vice President Roosevelt, spent about 3 months there, and then briefed Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley. McKinley ultimately himself murdered by an anarchist, which is how Teddy Roosevelt became president. I would say that in the politics of it, the kind of Republican progressive movement was more favorable to the Italian squad, and Tammany was really not too happy with it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine what community relations really were. I'm trying to imagine what the community relations were really like at that time, and why people didn't want to cooperate. So you said a few things, like I guess there was the language barrier.
Right.
There was also people living in close proximity to each other, to the people who are doing the crimes on them.
Right.
And they couldn't really protect them. Was there any other reason? Was there any other like social or historical reason why people who came from Italy at that time were jumpy about the cops?
Just in a nutshell, the Southern Italians were very much oppressed within their own country. That's why they were all flocking here and elsewhere. And their relations with the church, with the authority, with the law enforcement authorities, with their government, they were just estranged from it. They focused on family, and so it was just not. They had a very negative relationship with police in Italy, so that definitely carried over here. Mm-hmm. Liz? Yes.
Yeah, Joe Petrosino was born in Padula, in the Campania,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the town where my maternal grandmother was born,
Mm-hmm.
and we have been there, and there was a museum. We did go to the museum because it was closed, and believe it or not, it's a hill town. You approach it, it's totally flat, and you see there's a beautiful Certosa di San Lorenzo there, and then you go up to the hill. Petrosino, because I've read a book about him. Apparently, Roosevelt was extremely impressed by him.
Yes.
I mean, and that's why he was eager to see this squad established, because he felt that this young man had a real sense of what was going wrong in the Italian-American community, and how things that were happening in Italy, where storekeepers would have to pay a pizzo, a little money to keep their place safe. There were these people who were looking to basically use their own countrymen to make money, which was terrible. But he was quite a person, and the people there still revere him, and the people in the Italian American communities, especially the older people, like my aunt, who's 95 years old, remember him, remember the stories, remember all about that. And it was really in Williamsburg, Italian Brooklyn, even though it wasn't Bay Ridge or Bensonhurst, he was really considered someone very, very special and someone to be proud of.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm sure that this shows up in the book,
Mhm.
and among the other ones. I don't know about the other policemen. I'd like to know a little bit more about
Mhm.
them.
Others?
Did I understand you earlier to say that Petrosino began as a civil servant, as a street cleaner or a sanitation man?
Yeah, he was involved and became a foreman in loading up the garbage scows. So that was the street cleaning department in those days was part of the police department, and so there was an inspector nicknamed Clubber, Alexander Clubber Williams, who was famous in his own right. I think they depict him in The Gangs of New York, for example, right? And he liked what he saw there. I guess he knew that they did need some Italian-speaking police. There were very few. Petrosino was not the first, but there were just a handful, and the community was growing so quickly in the 80s and 90s.
The kind of disguises that Petrosino used in the beginning to kind of infiltrate, did the other detectives do that, or was that kind of a specialty of his? Did they follow?
No, others did it too. They would pose as laborers mainly, and they would just kind of pass. But one of the problems the squad had was that eventually they became very easily recognizable, and that was certainly a problem for Petrosino.
Well, I remember a story that in one dialect, Petrosino means parsley. And they would
Right.
say, like the pushcart vendors would say, parsley on sale today. And that would be
Right.
the signal that Petrosino was in
Right.
there.
That was so. The police commissioner, a commissioner named Bingham, wanted to start a so-called secret service that would report directly to him and infiltrate. And there would be civilians. They wouldn't even be people on the police department payroll or anything. So it was totally off the books secret service. And Tammany just would not go for that because they would wind up being investigated themselves. And seriously, and I mean, the commissioner threatened it. So he managed to raise some money on his own. It's not entirely clear where, but I think probably the Rockefeller, who'd had some problems with shakedowns and stuff, or his employees did. And he points Petrosino to head that so-called secret service, which is separate from the Italian squad, and like I said, totally under the radar. And that is the mission Petrosino is actually on when he goes to Italy. So it's a scene I could imagine happening when I covered City Hall, and the Tammany council members, aldermen, just couldn't stand him. He was this very patrician guy, former general, Republican, and just everything about him, said, turned off the Tammany people. And so they would always, harass him when he had to come in and testify. And they would not give him this money. And he, couldn't help bragging after a particularly tough hearing, telling reporters that Petrosino was on this mission right now. And that was supposed to be secret. It's the awful thing. And Petrosino arrived in Padula to see his brothers, and they told him it had been in the paper because it went in the Herald, and the Herald kind of had an international reach. It was translated into Italian papers and bits and pieces. He was like, oh my, he couldn't believe it. Right. And plus they sent him by himself. They were supposed to send somebody else with him, a captain who was at a station on Elizabeth Street. Not Italian, but he knew the ropes. And according to the Herald, they just didn't have the money because this was being funded by private donations, right? It's really terrible. And Petrosino himself, it's a sad story because he didn't even want to go on this trip. He had a terrible, I don't know, it was a cold, some kind of bronchial thing for a long time. He was just recovering from it. He was in his 40s, I think he was 48, and he just had an infant daughter, his first child. I know in the previous book I talk a little bit more about this. He confided to his pastor, Monsignor Carney, about it, and Monsignor told him not to go. And anyway, it was a sad thing. And he was compromised in Palermo. People definitely recognized who he was. And between the gangsters there in New York, and actually, those gangsters had connections to the real mafia, and a particular mafia don there, and whatever underlings they used, that, you know, he was murdered from behind. Yeah.
Any?
I got a question back there.
The name of the book talks about fighting the rise of the mafia. I find it kind of interesting because I don't know anything about the mafia from the 19th century. So to me, this is new and an interesting area. But I thought the mafia sort of reached one of its pinnacles in the 1980s and 1990s, or late 70s and 80s. And I'm just curious, because it says fought the rise of the mafia. So to what extent was he able to stop the rise of the mafia?
Well, I think that the mafia kind of coheres around 1930s, in the early 1930s. So we're looking at the period 1904 to 1922. And so the people who kind of started the first kind of mafia family, like, say, Joe Masseria, people like that, who were involved in the famous Castellamarese War, and from which the mafia kind of really emerged in the 30s. And there's others here who know more about this than I do, actually. That gang, that was the Lupo Morello gang that kind of eventually becomes the first family. In fact, there's a book about that gang called The First Family of what we would call the American Mafia. So you wouldn't have called them mafia, I don't think, properly in between 1904 and, say, 1920. But after that, it does start to cohere. As for the most powerful period of it, I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. But they certainly were an influence in New York, like in the 1940s and 50s. But, you know, so I don't know when they would be at the peak of their influence. There are others here who might have an opinion on that. Right, Greg? Greg Smith? No? You don't know? Okay, good. That's good. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any? Okay. Thank you all so much. Can I just say thank you to...
I would like to thank all of you for being here with us, Paul for writing the book and for presenting here with us, and Maria Laurino to offer a brilliant discussion, and we look forward to having Maria back to present her book. There are copies of the book upstairs, and I think Paul is going to be happy to sign them for you. Thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.